Welcome back to our seventh and final session of Exploring the World of the Gospels, our online class that's been examining the history, beliefs, and culture of the first century Jewish people to help us better read and understand the gospel stories. It's been a fun ride through an ancient world with you, and I hope you found it beneficial. But alas, it's coming to an end. Today, in our final talk, we're going to end our time by continuing our discussion from last session on the topic of values. I need to say, if you're just randomly jumping in here and you haven't watched session 6, I would encourage you to do so. Go ahead and go back and check it out. What we're going to talk about here in this session, we're going to cover, really builds upon what we've already been over in previous sessions. So just a brief recap, remembering values are the things that are the most important to you. They drive the way you live your life. They're what matters most. They determine your priorities, guide your choices. They determine how we interact and behave with other people. They are what is important to you as a person. At the end of the day, what you value the most is what will drive you, and it will be reflected in how you live and the decisions you make. Fair enough? And since values differ among people, especially across time and culture, it's important to take time to consider how those differing values may play into how other people act who are different than you. Case in point, reading the Bible stories often requires us to consider the differing values of the people in those stories to understand them. They're an ancient culture with different things that drove them, different priorities. They cared about different stuff. And so last session we began with one of the biggest and most different cultural values in the ancient world, what we talked about of group identity. This meant that the good of the group that you were a part of was more important, a greater value to you than you as an individual. You were taught that as a kid. A person found their identity. Who am I? My life priorities. What should I do? Not by looking inward, like what do I want, but as part of a group. What is this? What makes sense in a group? Every child was ingrained with the idea that they should think about the good of their group, their community, their family, is a big one, first. So we spent some time looking at families and the way they functioned as core groups for people. But again, if you missed it, if you don't remember, go back and watch session 6 before we move on, because this kind of builds and stacks on top of it. Because the next big social and cultural value that we need to talk through, is it definitely plays out in the Bible and is quite a bit different than us today, is directly tied to the value of group identity. It builds on it. They're almost two sides of the same coin in a way. And it's a cultural value we call honor and shame. Honor and shame. I've heard this. We're going to break it down. Let me start here. Have you ever been struggling with criticism and someone told you, don't worry what others think, or don't let the critics stop you from your dreams, right? Ever heard someone quote, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but your words will never hurt me"? Sure, we all have. The reason is because you and I live, as we talked about last week, in an individualistic society. Forget what other people think. Forget what people say about you. They don't matter. What matters is you doing what you love or what you want to do. It's almost an American mantra, isn't it? You do you. Don't worry about what other people say. Don't listen. But what if you didn't live in an individualistic society where you were the most important thing? Just track with me for a second. Imagine if you lived in a culture where your identity, how you saw yourself as a person, was found in being part of a collective. And from childhood, you were told the group, the family, matters more than you. What if family and connection with and to others was a core motivation for you? It's hard because most of us don't think that way. Belonging to a group meant everything. How often do you think you would hear someone say, "Don't worry what others think"? Never! Just the opposite. The opinions or views of the rest of the group you belong to would matter tremendously. That's where you find your value, your worth, your identity in the group as part of a collective. So if the people I'm connected with don't like or accept me, I am less. If I do something my group esteems more highly, I by nature feel better about myself. I'm doing what I should because the group is happy. Living in group identity culture means you find yourself caring deeply about what kinds of behavior would make you look better to the group, so you'd be accepted and well thought of, because your identity is with a group of people. And you would work to avoid behavior that would make the group think less of you, or worse, kick you out of their group. You need to avoid that at all costs. This is what we mean by honor and shame culture. In a group culture, honor and shame matter. And in this context, what we mean by honor is simply this. Honor is respect for being the kind of person or doing the kinds of things the group values. If people thought you were acting the way you were supposed to, that was honorable. That's an honorable man because he does what we think a person should do. When you said things or did things that aligned with how the group thought you should act, you received or were held in honor, which was huge because, again, group society, what others think about you is paramount. Honor was a claim to worth, to value, to esteem. Honor was also publicly acknowledged among your group. It was to gain status in the eyes of the others you were a part of. They looked up to you. Look at that guy. He's doing what he should. Look at that woman. She's great. They're acting the way they're supposed to act in the group. Honorable. That mattered. On the other hand, the opposite of this would be shame. Shame would be the loss of value and respect in the eyes of the rest of the group because you behaved in a way contrary to what they value, what's important to them, how they think you should. It was to be looked down upon, to lose value or worth in the eyes of others from behavior that was against or hurtful to the group. Actions that put your own needs above the rest or risked the good of the group, like cowardice or treachery, weakness, being unfaithful to your family and group, or a lack of generosity to the group, all indicate you lack honor and value and would bring shame on your life. But even smaller things that threatened or were counter to the accepted social order of the group could bring shame, like not showing the proper respect to people, or vice versa, being disrespected by someone publicly who was supposed to honor you. If you're an honorable person and they disrespect you, that's shameful. Like if your son did it to you last session. Shame can come from dressing inappropriately, or showing the wrong body parts in public, or acting contrary to any of the cultural manners and daily behavior that the group valued. Stay in line, act the way you're supposed to, and you'll be honored. You lost honor when someone tricked you, or you looked kind of dumb, or if they defeated you in an argument, which, side note, happened a lot when people argued with Jesus, didn't it? A lot of people came away with Jesus shamed. Or when you failed at doing something correctly. This wasn't a culture that said failure was okay. Just keep trying, learning experience. No, failure was shame. So don't try it if you're not going to succeed. Speaking of which, kind of a side point again, remember in Genesis when it talks about Adam and Eve being naked in the garden and not feeling shame? And then after sinning, they went into hiding because they were naked and they were shameful? That was speaking to an honor and shame culture. Feeling shame over nakedness in that context, it didn't mean they were embarrassed of their bodies all of a sudden. It spoke of shame in the sense of having done wrong or having acted inappropriately. Being naked in public was shameful behavior to the Jews. So this metaphor of them realizing they're naked was like, we've done horrible things. We've made a mistake. A person hearing that story in Jesus' day would have understood Adam and Eve knew they had been tricked, played the fool, and made a horrible decision, which meant they were now lowered in God's eyes and felt the need to hide from him in dishonor. It's all honor and shame culture. And God covering their nakedness spoke of him dealing with their shame and sort of allowing them to work through it. Stuff that just kind of for us, like, what are you talking about? Because we're not an honor and shame culture. We're not driven that way. Most of us have no shame, unfortunately. Because again, being shamed was much more than just being embarrassed. It was to lose face with the group, the community. It was to be thought less of. And to be thought less of when you're in a community is terrible. Many would rather die than do something that brought shame. This was a group-first people that cared deeply what others in the group thought of you. It wasn't a culture that spoke of self-esteem and valuing yourself, not worrying what others think. No, worry what others think. What others think is what matters. It's the most important thing because you're part of a group. The opinions of others was everything, and they would live their entire life with the goal of gaining esteem and honor from other people. Being raised in another person's eyes was the primary goal of life. Honorable. Look at you. Well done. So act and behave in such a way that others honor you. This was more important than wealth, fame, power, although they all actually usually came together. We'll get to that in a little bit. But to lose honor and be deeply shamed was, for some, worse than death. In some cultures, literally, suicide is the result of being shamed. And just another quick aside, too, because I like doing these. I think it's interesting. If you think about the third commandment in Exodus, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord. A lot of times people, maybe take the Lord's name in vain. Often in our culture today, we hear that and we think it means don't use God's name as like a curse word. Now, for the record, I don't think you should. Don't. But that isn't what the command is getting at. Rather, it's tied to the ancient custom of swearing an oath to another person and invoking a God's name as a way of sealing it. Like, I promise, and if I break my promise, God will hold me accountable. They didn't have courts and lawyers where you could just sue someone if they didn't pay you back. So swearing on a God's name was the best you could do. Why? Well, honor and shame culture. It doesn't seem like something that would have an effect on our culture because we don't think that way. We're individualists. We're not driven by honor and shame, thinking about honor and shame to the gods in my life and my reputation. But in a group culture where the honor of the group mattered, invoking the God of your group, the Israelites were God's people, meant that you now put God's honor as collateral on your promise. You were saying, the honor of my God and my people will be lowered if I don't do what I'm promising. I will bring shame to my community and my God if I don't follow through. And that was a huge deal. The name of a God was its reputation, integrity, honor, glory, renown, honor among the nations. So the call to glorify and uphold God's reputation was huge for the Israelites. It's all over the Old Testament. They were, if you recall from an earlier session, called to be a light to the world and demonstrate God's goodness. So they, his group, were responsible to maintain and uphold his reputation, his honor among the nations. So this command was part of the covenant agreement, whereby if they were going to be his people, they were going to be a group, his honor would be their responsibility. They would represent his reputation, so don't misuse it, right? In essence, the command to not misuse his name could probably better describe for us today if you'd say, hey, please don't put a Jesus bumper sticker on your car and then drive drunk. You're dishonoring his name as one of his followers. Or don't stand on a street corner with a belligerent sign that says, God hates gay people. No, he doesn't. You're misusing the name of God. You're damaging his reputation by your actions. That's what it means to not misuse the name of God. Okay? I need to move on. But next time you read through the Gospels, just keep this in mind. Every interaction people have with Jesus that someone freaks out about or gets upset and you aren't quite sure why, probably has something to do with honor and shame. Like a prostitute wiping Jesus' feet with her hair, honor and shame. The Messiah would be the king of the group and directly represent the group's honor, so his behavior should align appropriately with common Jewish custom and expectations. But Jesus didn't always behave according to social norms, and more importantly, he never prioritized honor above loving people. He was willing to be shamed if it meant loving people, and that was radical. Dying naked on a cross for us, but because of that, in the end, he was lifted up, exalted, seated at the right hand of the Father. He was honored, lifted up for his actions, despite them seeming shameful to some. And at the name of Jesus, every knee would bow. Those who choose to follow him and make him Lord will never be put to shame. Honor, shame. Oh, I gotta move on. I could preach that all day. Anyway, honor and shame. It's all over. So with all this in mind, there's another social value that really helps us understand more of Jesus' message into his culture that I want to focus on as we end our time. A people who value the group and its staunch divine order and roles and who live by a code of honor and shame with appropriate public behavior, do what you're supposed to. Acting the right way, being the right kind of person raised you up, and not acting the right way or being the wrong kind of person lowered you. This kind of society naturally developed a clear and strict level of what we would call social status. And this, maybe more than anything, is where Jesus really brought his wrecking ball to the party. I love this part so much. It's a lot of fun. Life in the first century, because of all these things we've talked about, was all about class structure, where those with the most honor and power and wealth, usually they were related, were at the top. And it all trickled down based on your station in life. Wherever you were at on the social ladder determined your life. And this group-based society believed that everyone was supposed to know their station and stick to it, and then show the proper honor and respect to those above you because they were more honorable. Now, it's important to note that having honor didn't necessarily mean you were all the way at the top. You actually could be at the bottom and still act honorably. But the higher up, the more honor you had, and thus the honorable thing to do was honor those above you. It was a vicious cycle, right? So a lowly person would act honorable by showing honor to someone above them. And compliance, obedience to your betters was ingrained in these people. Understand your place, know where you're at on the social ladder, and act appropriately. So everyone in that society knew who they were beneath and who they were above, who they were better than, socially. Society was basically organized in such a way that the rich, elite ruling class basically just lived off the work of the lower class through taxes and government control. And this, of course, led to tremendous oppression of those without power and lower status, people in the bottom of the barrel, like the poor, children, women, infirm, and slaves. They were at the very bottom of the social order, and it kind of just, there was a pecking order in life. You always knew where you were at, top, bottom, somewhere around here. Of course, the average person living in the time of Jesus would have been towards the bottom of the social pecking order. Most people were down here, not up here. Most were peasant farmers, barely surviving. Kind of a side note, you see, Palestine grew a number of important products like grapes, olives, walnuts, had rich soil, places for important foods like grain, all things Jesus speaks a lot about, because that's his world, that made it an extremely wealthy land for those who actually owned and controlled the land. So you essentially had a small group of wealthy, powerful landowners at the top who kind of owned everything, some merchants, maybe political leaders, who all basically lived off the work of the rest. Estimates say probably 2/3 of all the land was owned by 1% to 2% of the population. You're talking about, our 1% idea. It was worse than that, often Romans. This created what we call a feudal system, which is where the poor would work for the rich landowners who would own all the land, and the tenant farmer poor would just be just enough to survive, while the high-up person would live in luxury and get all this great benefits from these poor people working the land. So owning land was huge. And this explains why Jesus often told parables about a master and servants working the land. That's a feudal system. It was language they knew and understood well. I own the land, you go work it for me, you can eat some of the food. Barely enough, but so be it. So this meant people lived in rural farming areas, not in cities like we do today. Estimates put the rural population around 90%, which probably 1 out of 10 people might have lived in what you and I call a city. The wealthy would live in large estate-like homes with slaves and servants to work for them. Most people just lived in a small 1 to 2 room mud brick house, often connected to other mud brick homes that made up your extended family, like we talked about in the previous session. Most people didn't have much. And while not all farmers, roughly maybe 95% of the population worked in some form of what we'd call a primary industry, which made them lower class, fishing, craft work, stonemasonry, carpentry, things like that. This is why Jesus' parables often focused a lot on things like farming, sowing seeds, or fishing, fishers of men, building. Textiles were important trade, which is why there's so many sheep everywhere. Here's a thought. The U.S. Department of Labor lists on its website all the jobs that are available in our nation. There are hundreds and thousands of different jobs you can have in America today. Tax records from just 1,000 years ago in Europe list 157 total, which means it was probably far less in Jesus' day. You didn't have a lot of options and were most often towards the bottom. You didn't have the large intellectual educated class we have today, the middle class. There were few what you and I would call white-collar workers. So essentially, there was no middle class. You had a few people at the top. And then most of the people kind of at the bottom just doing enough to survive. Most made just enough money to eat each day, which is why Jesus would tell them, hey, pray that God would give us today our daily bread, because most people lived day to day for food. The people he were talking to, that was their life. After heavy taxes, trade, and obligations, tenant farming, you may only have 20% of your own crop to actually live off of with your whole family. The rest would go to some rich person you didn't know. You could work hard and never get ahead as much as just survive. Part of the reason why these people were angry all the time. And for the majority then, most would wear maybe a simple tunic, a basic body covering that went down to your knees and left your shoulders bare. Average person might own one cloak to cover up when colder, maybe one pair of sandals. That's it. They didn't need a lot of closet space. Now, richer people might have more options or longer tunics that went to the ankles. Those with more money might have a special occasion outfit for weddings and such. Remember the prodigal son story, how he's given the best robe? That would be like a family heirloom, like, ooh, dressed up for a wedding or something. Nicer clothing signified status, of course, just like today, kind of. Women would show their social status through jewelry, nicer clothing, makeup. Paul addresses that in the New Testament. That's why the Bible addresses the idea of women not going over the top, because it was a social status issue. Women would also cover their hair as a sign of modesty. Again, uncovered hair in that culture was a sign of promiscuity. Prostitutes would usually let their hair down to let men know they're interested. So again, that story of the woman washing Jesus', for him to allow a woman to touch his feet with her hair was extremely risque and shameful. It ties together. It would have lowered the eyes of the people in the community. But the average person would only own one of everything. So again, clothing was valuable. That's why they would fight over clothes at executions like they did over Jesus's. Remember they fought over his clothes? Interesting side note, or they casted lots. John tells us that Jesus' tunic they fought over was seamless, which but historically speaking, that was not super nice. That was kind of a lower class thing to wear. So Jesus did probably not, he didn't dress to impress, basically. Clothing was valuable. They fought over it. Jesus seemed to just wear the simplest thing. Remember him saying, if someone sues you for your shirt, give them your cloak also? That would have been giving away almost all of your earthly possessions for a poor person. And since they all wore sandals, their feet would get pretty gross. There was no sewage system. They would just throw it out in the roadways. So the rich would have slaves that would wash their feet as they walked in their house. And it was the most disgusting, demeaning thing to do, to literally wipe feces off someone's feet. So next time you read about Jesus washing feet, pause a bit and think through the implications. That was the most shameful, demeaning action one could do. It was to debase and dishonor yourself. To act like a slave was shameful. He was doing something that everyone would have looked down on him for doing. How did his followers feel about that? We'll come back to that. Now, along with being poor, life back then was also difficult because there was no health care or social services. A disaster or sickness could easily ruin you. Life was precarious. The average life expectancy might have been around 25 to 30, with infancy being a complete gamble. Children, do you survive, do you not survive? If you survived your childhood, life expectancy actually was closer to 40. That shows how many children would die. What's more, having children was a roll of the dice as well, with many dying in pregnancy. Pregnancy was probably the main cause of death for women in the ancient world. Some studies suggest that more than half of peasant families would have been broken due to the death of one or both parents during childbearing years. Think of that, half. It was more normal to have lost a parent than to have both of them in the ancient world. So Jesus losing Joseph, his father, was the norm in his day. Remember, Joseph's not alive in Jesus' later life. And no wonder the key to survival in this world was close-knit families that extended beyond the immediate. They were your only hope if tragedy struck. You had to be in a group. The group mattered because safety was in the group, protection was in the group. Any hope of getting by if things bad happened came in the group. There's no government aid or life insurance. If you lost your spouse or your parents, you were left to fend for yourself. Widows and orphans without families were everywhere and a huge part of society, with no one to care for them if they weren't part of a group. Life was hard and uncertain. You needed the family, the people to hold you together. You needed something. So just think about Jesus stepping into that world, bringing healing to the sick. People with no hope and calling his followers to care for those with no family, to give to those in need. The early Christians were known for caring for the sick and the poor when no one else would. So the crowds would flock to Jesus and bring their sick and dying. Because how else would they find hope? This was an oppressed, poor, and lowly people seeking hope from their God and finding it in Jesus, a man who preached blessing to the poor. Blessed are you who are poor. Yours is the kingdom of heaven. But again, it was also a world that was extremely stratified with clear social status levels. You had the ruling elites, the large landowners, and wealthy merchants at the top, then craftsmen, lowly peasants class beneath. Jesus himself was somewhere between a peasant and a craftsman like most, but honestly, they're both pretty low on the totem pole. Even peasants, though, were better off than the destitute, beggars, prostitutes, widows, no support. At the very bottom, you had slaves who had no rights at all. They had no honor. Now, slavery is an interesting thing. I can't spend a lot of time on it, but it was extremely common in the Roman Empire, even among Jews. It's estimated that somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of every person living in Rome at the time of Jesus was enslaved. 1/3? That's hundreds of thousands of people, which helps us understand a bit more why so many of Jesus' stories involved slaves. He speaks about slaves all the time. Your Bible just often translates it as servant. In speaking to a large crowd, he may be addressing hundreds of slaves listening to him. They might be everywhere. Now, slavery was a bit different than how we think of it today in that it had nothing to do with race. Slavery was not related to race. Slaves were often war prisoners or people who couldn't pay off their debts, or the children of those who couldn't. Sometimes people were even kidnapped and sold as slaves. There was a whole business, side note. But either way, slavery was not a good life, obviously. You held no power, you had no rights, you couldn't own property, you couldn't marry people without your master's permission. You were at the bottom of society, you were shamed, you faced constant and unchecked abuse. But even then, speaking of status order, you had social hierarchy among slaves, even within one household. One slave might keep fires burning beneath the bath or clean latrines, while another raised the kids or handled finances, and I'm better than you. You're both slaves, but I'm better. Everything was who's better, who's worse, higher or lower. The whole world, top to bottom, saw themselves through the lens of social status. Their world was much closer to the caste systems of India today than anything America would ever experience. We're all about equality, individuality. The ancient world was not. Equality was not a value of the ancient world. People were not equal. People were better than other people. Now, what's more, these clearly defined and followed social ranks meant life in this world was governed by social rules or etiquettes based upon your class. There were rules about who you should talk to first when two people met on the street, who should even make eye contact, right? Who had a higher social rank. Rules regarding who you should invite to your house for a dinner banquet. Which side, should you sit on? So banquets demonstrated social status. Who was and who wasn't invited, who came and who didn't, and where they sat, what was served. Everything would have spoken to honor and shame and status. The most honored person would take the head of the seat. You could shame an enemy by not inviting them to your party. Or worse, you could invite them and put them at the end of the table, and they would be shamed in front of the whole group. This stuff's war, man. This is the world they lived in. Honor, shame, status. Sometimes the opening of a home and allowing lower class people in would help the head of the household gain honor. Oh, look at you. You invited some poor people. Well done. But it was all about power, social standing, gaining honor, not being shamed. So being great in the Roman kingdom was basically about getting higher and having more people serve you. Gaining in honor, having more and more people speak highly of you and lift you up. Well, honor and status were usually inherited through high social rank or family. It could also be acquired through social advancement, public accomplishments by excelling over others, stepping on and over anyone to get to the top of the social status ladder, getting more honor, being seen by others as greater and they're better. This was the primary goal of most of the upper echelon people, right? I don't know how much it was for the lower people, but if you're at the top, it was all about getting higher and higher. And the people at the bottom just kind of suffered. Now, while these status levels were defined, you knew who you were better than and you knew who was better than you. And while social etiquette was to know your role and stay in your lane, even for those at the bottom, the lower sides, it actually was possible to move up. And obviously it's possible to move down. Moving up was difficult. Most pressure was pushing people down, not up. Again, people lived on the precipice with no insurance or backup. A wealthy merchant could become a beggar with one twist of bad luck. A governing official could become a slave after the loss of a military battle. A highly honored and respected person could be shamed and fall among the community through the actions of, I don't know, a wayward son. But a person could theoretically rise up the ladder and gain an honor even from the bottom if the right opportunity arose and they had a bit of help. It was all about someone who was already up there pulling them up. It couldn't be done alone. If you were on the bottom, if you were a peasant, if you were lower class, you had no access to higher society unless someone in higher society brought you up. For in a world that you couldn't just borrow some money and go to college and improve yourself or just work really hard and get your dream job, it didn't work that way. You worked hard at your job and you stayed at your job your whole life. You couldn't post a stupid video on Instagram and suddenly be rich and famous. Did not work that way. If you were poor, you were lower class, there's basically nothing you could do to ever be anything more than that. That's your lot in life. However, you could seek help from someone above you by aligning yourself with someone up there, someone more powerful, or maybe just a little bit ahead of you. Someone up there on the social ladder, you could be elevated with them. Of course, they would want something from you as well. This was called patronage, or a client-patron relationship. Where you would basically become someone's patron, they would be your patron and lift you up. It essentially worked like this. A richer upper class person kind of up here would offer some kind of favor, or grace was the word they would use, gift, to a lesser person down here, loaning them money, inviting them to a banquet, maybe coming to something that was above their station so people could see them, arranging a marriage to a better family or a job that sort of raised their status, something to bring up their fortune and honor in the community, help them make something better of their life. Of course, like all graces or gifts in the ancient world, they came with strings. There would be an expected return. When you gave someone a gift, a grace, you always expected something back. And the price tag was usually based on the value of the gift. The greater the gift, the more expected return. Oftentimes, this was simply a matter of increased honor in the community. For the more people a patron could sponsor and have people underneath them, the better they looked in society, honor, group. But sometimes they would actually ask these people they sponsored to literally say nice things about them in public. All right, go out and tell people how wonderful I am. Increase my reputation and my honor. Or worse, sabotage my enemy. I don't like that guy. Go tell people, he does something terrible, sleeps with goats or something. But mostly, it simply came down to having loyalty or faith, as they would call it back then. In exchange for grace, the greater benefactor would expect the lesser person to give them their faith, be loyal, to be a faithful friend, sometimes doing favors, available to them, speaking well of them. And yes, if this talk of grace and faith is causing your theological ears to perk up a bit, it should, but you'll have to join my Rise to Life class to explore that more. So there you go. Sorry, you don't want to miss out. Ultimately though, this was kind of a symbiotic win-win type relationship. And usually the only hope of a lower class person to ever make something of their life above them. And the entire ancient world was arranged this way, with most people finding themselves in some kind of relationship with people above them and below them and looking for ways to connect with someone who could make their life better. Now, why am I telling you all this? Well, just right to the point, the followers of Jesus, a potential king, Messiah, who could offer them some serious grace, right? I'm rising, I'm going to be king. They weren't immune to that. Remember the two that come to Jesus and ask for top spots? In Mark, it says that James and John, they're arguing and they come to Jesus. Hey, Jesus, teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. And he's like, oh, all right. Well, what do you want? They say, let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory, in your honor. When you are at the top pinnacle, when you've made it, we want to sit at the top. The left and right was to take the positions of greatest honor. At a banquet, the left and right of the head of the banquet. At a king's palace or a courtroom, left and right that was as high as you could get beneath the head guy. The positions of greatest social standing in a kingdom or the top of the ladder, right? So why were the disciples so willing to just drop everything in their lives and follow Jesus? Just give up their careers and leave their families, risking shame among the community, follow this guy around? Just really nice beard? No. He was the prophesied Messiah, then he would become king and throw off Roman oppression. He would be their best hope to improve their lot in life. poor peasants and fishermen following around the potential king. This would be the greatest example of patronage they would have understood. If this guy's the Messiah, we give him our loyalty and we rise with him. We rise with Christ. In exchange for faith, he gives grace. So of course they would follow him, give him whatever you want, we're with you. Grace from the Messiah would mean great honor. Being a servant of the king was a big deal, way up on the social ladder, right? Way up. Even if you're a servant of the king, you are an important person. So just imagine how they felt when their meal tickets start saying some crazy talk about giving to the poor, suffering, touching lepers, laying your life down, being a slave. What? Give up my life? Slave? Servant? What are you talking about here? We're giving you our faith, our loyalty, because we see you as helping us grow in honor. Like, the grace we're looking for is make our lives better, not make it worse and be shameful like lowly slaves. You're telling us to go the wrong way. Remember the story of the rich, young, upper society kid ruler who comes and he wants to follow Jesus? This was exactly what they all needed, right? Someone high up with lots of honor and social standing. Someone big in the community that could bring some legitimacy to the movement, bring honor to all the rest of them. Someone who can fund their rebellion, maybe some political support. This is what it was going to take to get Jesus up on the throne. What did Jesus do? Yeah, go sell everything you have and give it to the poor. Give up your entire social standing. Dishonor yourself. Yikes! Sure enough, that thins out the crowd, doesn't it? People slowly begin to give up on this, shall we say, unpopular brand of Messiah. Not the kind of king who's bringing the kind of grace they want. But that was Jesus. He didn't come playing by the status rules of honor and social standing. And being his follower, if he's your patron, giving him your faith may not go where you hoped or expected. He wasn't interested in gaining more honor or obsessing over public opinion. He cared about people. There was a group sense to him, but I don't care what you think of me. He was interested in the lost sheep, the unloved, the outcast, the disowned, the shamed and dishonored, but loved by God. And he died for them, a shameful death on a Roman cross, to give us honor. That's a great story, right? That is the story of the Bible. Well, guys, okay, that's it for now. I hope you've enjoyed our time together exploring the world of the Gospels. I've certainly had a lot of fun recording these and sharing them with you. I hope it's been helpful and opened the door to seeing the multifaceted cultural and religious world the Gospels take in. And hopefully it's given you a deeper sense of why understanding this stuff matters. Of course, I also don't want you walking away, let down or kind of freaked out. There's just so much information. These 7 short sessions were barely scratching the surface. I'm sure you know that. There's so much more you can learn and discover. But why not? I don't want you to be discouraged. I want you to, hopefully something like this encourage you to go learn more, to read more, to talk more. My desire is this course would raise an interest and motivate you and encourage you to keep learning, keep looking, keep exploring. Because this is God's Word, and the more we understand it, the more it's going to impact our lives. Thanks, everyone.